Welcome to the Envoy of Venice, a newsletter and podcast focusing on international politics. In this week's episode, the focus is on Syria and why it is in the EU's interest to lift the sanctions. An analysis by Máté Szalai. In recent weeks, Syria's international situation has changed dramatically. On May 13th, U.S. President Donald Trump announced in Saudi Arabia that the United States would lift the sanctions imposed on Syria over the past decade, signaling a new, friendlier chapter in U.S.-Syrian relations. Subsequently, the European Union also began lifting its coercive measures against Syria. There is little doubt that dismantling the sanctions regime will have a positive effect on the Syrian economy and humanitarian situation. Regardless of what one thinks about the new leadership or the president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, the available data paint a grim picture of the challenges the Syrian society faces. According to UN data, 90% of the population lives below the poverty line. Around 16 million people need assistance. And in addition to 6 million refugees abroad, more than 7 million people are internally displaced. For them, the lifting of sanctions is a necessary but insufficient condition to recover from the current crisis. Despite the clear humanitarian need, many urged U.S. and European leaders to exercise caution regarding Syria. This stems primarily from two reasons. First, Ahmed al-Sharaa and his new leadership come from jihadist, extremist circles and previously fought not only against the Syrian regime, but also the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq. There is no guarantee that al-Sharaa will not govern the country in an authoritarian or violent manner. Second, the internal Syrian conflicts, including sectarian and ethnic tension that contributed to the outbreak and prolongation of the civil war, remain unresolved. This is evidenced by recent clashes affecting several minority groups. Nevertheless, I believe lifting sanctions is currently the best political decision for the EU. The new situation offers an opportunity not only for Syria's stabilization, but also for the survival of a sustainable Syrian government with improved EU relations. While we should not ignore our concerns, Syria's reintegration should be seen not as a weapon, but as an incentive, one that could lead not only to better conditions for Syrian society, but also to the advancement of European interests. The legacy of a 14-year civil war. The new Syrian leadership should be viewed in the context of the country's history, particularly the civil war that raged for 15 years. The Syrian Revolution, which began in 2011 as part of the regional developments often called the Arab Spring, emerged against the Assad regime that had ruled the country since 1970. The government, under the rule of President Bashar al-Assad, responded to political and economic demands with violent repression, aiming to intimidate Syrians. This brutality radicalized the opposition, resulting in a protracted civil war that claimed around 600,000 lives, making it one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century. The brutality of the conflict can be attributed to several factors, chief among them Bashar al-Assad himself, who is likely to be remembered as one of the most ruthless authoritarian leaders in modern history. Unlike other Arab leaders, Assad clung stubbornly to power, even at the cost of mass killings and using weapons of mass destruction against his own people. Even near the end of his rule, he preferred shifting to a war economy to drug production and trafficking than negotiating with the international community. External interventions also exacerbated the crisis. Iran and, from 2015 onwards, Russia supported the Assad regime heavily. On the other side, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and, for a time, the U.S. backed elements of the opposition. Some of these countries, particularly Turkey, Israel, and the U.S., also intervened directly in the conflict based on their own interests. With so many actors involved, coordination broke down quickly, resulting in the quick fragmentation of the Syrian opposition. This fragmentation was exploited by groups like the Islamic State and al-Qaeda. Ahmed al-Sharaa's group, the Organization for the Liberation of Syria, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, emerged from al-Qaeda and became a dominant force due to its Islamic ideology and military effectiveness. They consolidated their rule in Idlib, the last major opposition-held area, and after years of preparation, launched a surprisingly swift military campaign against regime forces at the end of 2024, which succeeded in just 2 weeks. Why support a post-Islamist government? Given this background, it's understandable why there are doubts about Sharaa, whom President Trump called a man with a strong past. He is a former radical with ties to al-Qaeda and ISIS, clearly intent on holding power, at least temporarily. Whether Sharaa can or will address internal problems, and whether he will pay adequate attention to ethnic, particularly Kurdish Arab, and religious tensions, remains to be seen. These concerns are valid. Yet, Supporting the lifting of sanctions and engaging with the Syrian leadership appears to be a sound decision. First, after 14 years of civil war, expecting a democratic moderate leadership is unrealistic. None of the actors in Syria has remained morally untainted. As harsh as it is to say, Assad's rule set the normative bar so low that Sharia can easily surpass it. Second, over the past 6 months, the new leadership has shown pragmatism and flexibility. The government seems to play an integrative role rather than imposing a conservative Islamic interpretation on secular Muslims, Christians, and other minorities. In Damascus, the approach toward the Kurdish-led militias in the northeast has leaned more toward negotiation than confrontation. Moderate opposition figures and even former regime politicians have been included in the transitional government and state apparatus. Third, foreign policy under the new leadership is also guided by pragmatism. Countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, which previously had ties with HTS and Sharia, have fully backed the new government. Even the UAE, traditionally critical of Islamist groups, is open to cooperation. Damascus is also working to maintain stable relations with some former Assad allies, such as Russia and Iraq, and has held informal talks even with Israel. The European perspective. These developments are promising from a European standpoint. Geopolitically, it is also in our interest to cooperate with Sharia. Syria's stability is valuable in itself, as the events of the 2010s, the rise of ISIS, and the mass exodus of refugees have shown. The current government has no chance of achieving stability without lifting sanctions and receiving significant European assistance. Beyond that, Syria is a key state in the EU's neighborhood policy and in the Middle East. Cooperation could bring tangible political and economic benefits. Given the war in Ukraine, it is particularly welcome that influence in a Mediterranean country is shifting from Russia and Iran to NATO member Turkey or the Gulf states, which have extensive collaboration with NATO, the US, and several European countries. Of course, we must not forget the concerns mentioned above, the most serious of which is the questionable democratic affiliation of the HTS leadership. But cooperation is a much better incentive for addressing normative concerns than making those concerns a precondition. Syria simply lacks the time and capacity to prioritize alignment with European sensibilities over stabilization. Also, when emphasizing inclusiveness and diversity, caution is warranted. Many Syrians want to move beyond the divisive politics of the Assad era and do not view society primarily through ethnic or sectarian lenses. I hope you enjoyed our show. If so, please follow us on the platform you are listening to our podcast and subscribe to our newsletter on Substack. theinvoyavenis.substack.com. Until next time.